All right, so let's dive right in, shall we? This whole situation with the war in Ukraine and the constant back and forth, well, it feels like every time you turn around, there's a new development or some high-level meeting or statement that drops. And frankly, it can be tough to keep up. So today we're going to try to sift through all of that. You know what I'm talking about? All the news snippets, the official statements, those sorts of things. We're going to try to really get beyond the headlines and figure out what it all means for Ukraine, obviously, but also for Europe, for the global power balance. I mean, this is some serious stuff, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that's really caught my attention is this upcoming meeting in Saudi Arabia. I mean, picture this. You have U.S. And Russian officials meeting to basically decide Ukraine's fate. But get this, neither Ukraine nor any European countries are even at the table.
Right. It's almost like it's this secret backroom deal being made, and I can't help but wonder about the choice of venue as well. I mean, Saudi Arabia, it feels like a deliberate move away from those traditional European allies, don't you think? Like, is the U.S. really willing to risk those relationships for this?
It's a gamble, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, Saudi Arabia has been working hard to position itself as a kind of independent power broker, one that can mediate between different sides, and this venue kind of plays into that image. But yeah, you're right. It could also be seen as a snub to those European allies, especially those who have been there for Ukraine.
Yeah. And then you have Zelensky understandably upset about it. He said, quote, "We cannot recognize anything or any agreements about us without us." But at the same time, Ukraine is so dependent on Western aid. Doesn't that kind of limit their options, even if they don't like what's being decided?
Sadly, yes. That's the dilemma Ukraine is stuck with. I mean, they want to assert their sovereignty. Yeah. But they need that international support to keep fighting. So if the U.S. and Russia come to some agreement, one that Ukraine hates, well, it's going to be really tough for them to push back against that.
So while all of this is happening in these closed-door meetings, you have European leaders scrambling to figure out how to respond. And Zelensky, right in the middle of it all, calling for a 1 million-strong European army. I mean, whoa. Is this the start of a major power shift? Is he right to suggest that the era of guaranteed U.S. support for Europe is over?
I think he's sending a clear message to Europe, a wake-up call, if you will. He's done with vague promises. He wants real, tangible security boots on the ground, planes in the air, you name it. He even said it himself. He wants guarantees on the ground, on the water, in the sky, not guarantees on paper. And after what happened with Russia's invasion, you can see why he's skeptical of anything less,
Yeah, I mean, talk about broken promises, right? But on that note, what about the whole question of Ukraine joining NATO? You have U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying point blank that it's not realistic right now. So what's the deal with that?
Well, NATO's been hesitant about letting Ukraine in for a while now, mainly because of the whole Russia thing. Article 5 is the one that says an attack on one is an attack on all. Adding Ukraine would make things so much more tense. It could basically drag NATO into a direct war with Russia if things went south.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a huge risk. So what's the alternative then? Zelensky has talked about a NATO-like security structure inside Ukraine. Could that even work, and what would that even look like?
It's a complicated idea for sure. It would need a ton of investment from the West, training equipment, intelligence sharing, basically building up Ukraine's defenses so they can stand on their own without actually being in NATO.
Interesting. So that brings us to what the U.S. has called the painful compromises that both Russia and Ukraine are going to have to make for any peace deal to actually work. Let's start with Ukraine. What kind of concessions are we even talking about here?
Well, on Ukraine's side, we're looking at possible territorial concessions, maybe losing Crimea, which Russia took back in 2014, and parts of the Donbas region, too. There could also be pressure for neutrality agreements, meaning Ukraine would promise not to join NATO or any other military alliance. Basically staying out of the big power blocks,
Yeah, I see. But I mean, those are some tough pills to swallow, especially after all Ukraine's gone through. But what about Russia? They've been pretty stubborn, haven't they? What compromises are they realistically expected to make?
They have been pretty uncompromising in their messaging. That's true. But the reality is they've hit some roadblocks in the war, and those economic sanctions are definitely biting. The U.S. seems to be banking on the idea that Russia will eventually have to back down, withdraw troops, offer some kind of security guarantees to Ukraine, and maybe even face some consequences for alleged war crimes.
Okay, but here's the thing that throws a wrench in this whole compromise idea. You have Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, basically doubling down on the idea that Ukraine is inherently Russian territory, echoing Putin's whole one people narrative. I mean, how can you even talk about compromises when Russia's still pushing that?
That's the really tricky part. While most historians disagree with those claims about Ukraine's history, it's at the core of Putin's justification for the invasion. So it becomes a huge roadblock because it raises the question of whether Russia's actually willing to accept Ukraine's independence and sovereignty.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a lot to unpack, isn't it? All these secret talks, shifting alliances, and these deep-seated historical narratives. It's like we're at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the coming weeks could have a massive impact on everyone.
it's a pivotal moment for sure. And the stakes are incredibly high, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire world.
We'll be back in a moment to dig deeper into the potential fallout of these negotiations and explore what a possible resolution might look like. Yeah, it really does make you wonder how they'll ever come to an agreement with all of this going on, right? I mean, we're talking about potentially redrawing borders, changing alliances, and challenging some really deep-seated beliefs about history and what it means to be a nation.
And we can't forget about the people caught in the middle of all of this, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical stuff. But ultimately, it's real people on the ground whose lives are being impacted by these decisions.
Absolutely, and Zelensky has been very vocal about that. Refusing to participate in these Saudi talks, he said, quote, "You can't decide our fate without us." But now he's planning his own trip to Saudi Arabia, so what's the deal with that? Is he trying to play both sides?
I don't think it's about playing sides. It's more strategic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
He knows these talks are happening, whether he likes it or not. But by going to Saudi Arabia himself, he's making sure Ukraine's voice is heard,
Mm-hmm.
even if they're not at the main table.
So it's like he's trying to work the system from the inside. And we can't forget about his efforts to rally support in Europe, especially with this whole European army thing he's pushing for. What are the chances of that actually happening? And what would it even look like in practice?
A million-strong European army. I mean, that's a huge undertaking. There are logistical hurdles, financial hurdles, you name it. I think the bigger question is whether Europe is ready to step up and take on more responsibility for its own defense,
Yeah.
especially if the U.S. is really shifting its focus away from Europe.
You mentioned earlier that the U.S. might be backing away from its traditional role as the guarantor of European security. How are European leaders reacting to that?
It's a mixed bag, I'd say.
Yeah, I'll be
Some
fair.
anxiety, definitely. A lot of European countries have relied on the U.S. for security for decades. So the thought of having to do more themselves is a little scary. But there's also this growing sense that Europe needs to be able to act independently,
Mhm.
to defend its own interests without always relying on the U.S.
So a wake-up call for everyone involved, really. But going back to those painful compromises for a second, we talked about territorial concessions, Ukraine possibly giving up Crimea and parts of Donbass. Is that something Zelensky would even consider? Or is that a hard no?
It's a sensitive topic for sure, and it's hard to say what Zelensky's absolute red lines are. Publicly, he said Ukraine's territorial integrity is non-negotiable, but there are also people within Ukraine saying maybe. Holding on to every inch of territory isn't the best strategy in the long run, you know?
So even within Ukraine, there's debate about how far they're willing to go. What about the idea of neutrality? Could Ukraine agree to stay out of NATO if they got security guarantees from Russia and the West?
It's a possibility that's been thrown around, but it raises a lot of questions. Would Russia actually honor those guarantees? Would the West be willing to defend Ukraine even if it's not a NATO member? Those are big ifs.
And that's where Zelensky's insistence on more than just guarantees on paper comes in, right? He wants actions, not just words.
Exactly.
Okay.
He wants to know that if Russia attacks again, there will be a real response, not just talk. And that's why this idea he's floated about a NATO-like security structure inside Ukraine is so interesting.
Ambitious, for sure. But could something like that actually deter Russia? And would it need so much support from the West that it's basically NATO in disguise?
It would definitely take a lot of commitment from the West, training equipment, intelligence, you name it. But it wouldn't necessarily be a carbon copy of NATO. There are other examples around the world where countries have gotten significant military aid from bigger powers without becoming formal allies.
So there are precedents. Okay? But even if something like that happened, could it really guarantee Ukraine's safety in the long run?
There are no guarantees in this game, just calculations of risk and deterrence. The hope would be that a strong Ukrainian military, backed by strong international support, would make Russia think twice before attacking again.
But what if these talks just totally flop? What if all this diplomacy goes nowhere? Then what?
The most likely outcome is that the war drags on, maybe even escalates in ways we can't predict.
Yeah.
It could turn into this long, drawn-out conflict with neither side willing to give in, and that would mean even more death and destruction. Not to mention the economic fallout, which we're already starting to feel would get much worse.
Higher energy prices, supply chain issues, the constant threat of things escalating. It's a grim picture.
It is. And that's why these negotiations are so crucial.
Hmm.
The whole world is watching, hoping for a breakthrough, but also preparing for the possibility that things could get even worse.
It's heavy stuff. It's easy to focus on the negative. But before we wrap up, let's try to look at the other side. What would a successful outcome even look like? What would a peace agreement have to achieve to be considered a win, not just for Ukraine, but for everyone?
That's the million-dollar question. And it goes beyond just stopping the fighting. A real peace deal would have to address the root causes of the conflict, the security concerns, of course, but also these issues of national identity, historical narratives, Ukraine's right to choose its own path forward. It's a lot to untangle.
It does sound like a huge challenge, but if we want a lasting peace, we can't just stop the fighting. We have to deal with the deeper issues that caused it in the first place. And that means some really tough conversations, a lot of empathy and being willing to see things from different perspectives.
Exactly. And it also needs all sides to commit to respecting international law, respecting each other's sovereignty, and finding peaceful solutions to disagreements.
It's a good reminder that peace is more than just the absence of war. It's about building a world where every nation, big or small, can coexist and pursue their own goals without fear.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it's a goal worth fighting for, even when things seem impossible. Because the alternative, a world of endless conflict and tension, is just too terrible to imagine.
We'll be back in just a bit to wrap up this deep dive into the world of international diplomacy and leave you with some final thoughts. Okay, so we've spent this whole deep dive really picking apart this whole diplomatic scramble going on around the war in Ukraine. Secret meetings in Saudi Arabia, a potential European army. It's a lot to take in.
It really does show you just how complicated this situation is and how high the stakes are for everyone.
One of the things that really stands out to me is just how much uncertainty there is right now. It's like all these different players, all with their own agendas and trying to predict what's going to happen. It's almost like trying to predict the weather. You can look at the forecasts, but you never really know for sure.
Yeah, uncertainty is always a part of geopolitics. But it's definitely amplified in situations like this, where so much is on the line. But here's the thing. Uncertainty can also create opportunities, for creative solutions, for breakthroughs that might not have happened in a more predictable situation.
So you're saying even with all this tension and uncertainty, there's still hope for things to take a turn for the better?
Absolutely. Diplomacy is all about navigating uncertainty, about finding common ground, even when it seems impossible. And sometimes those moments of greatest uncertainty, that's when you see the most unexpected breakthroughs.
That's kind of reassuring. But let's go back to those painful compromises the U.S. keeps talking about. We talked about concessions from both sides, but honestly, has Russia really said anything that makes you think they're ready to compromise? I mean, they've been pretty stubborn, haven't they?
Their rhetoric has been very, very tough. That's true. Lavrov going on about those historical claims, about Ukraine inherently being Russian territory, that seems like a huge roadblock to any kind of real compromise. But remember, a lot of diplomacy happens behind closed doors. What they say publicly might not be the whole story.
So there's a chance they're more open to negotiation than they're letting on. What could be pushing them in that direction, though?
Well, things haven't exactly gone their way on the battlefield, and those economic sanctions are starting to hurt. Maybe there's a growing sense in the Kremlin that this war just isn't sustainable in the long term,
I guess we can hope. But let's switch gears for a second. What about Ukraine? What are their non-negotiables? What price would be too high for them to pay for peace?
That's the question Zelensky's wrestling with right now, and it's a tough one. He's got pressure from all sides. Some people saying make concessions, others saying fight to the end. He has to balance the costs of continuing the war against the consequences of accepting a peace deal that might feel like a betrayal of everything Ukraine has sacrificed.
It's a huge weight on his shoulders, for sure. And it brings us back to that question we asked earlier, if you were in Zelensky's shoes. What would your non-negotiables be? What would you be willing to give up for peace, and what would be absolutely off the table?
It's a good question to think about. It really makes you confront the complexities of this whole situation. The moral dilemmas, the weight of responsibility that leaders have in times of crisis. It reminds us that there are no easy answers. Every decision comes with a cost.
And we can't forget that there are real people at the heart of all of this. People whose lives have been turned upside down by this war. Their stories matter, and they deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. This isn't just some abstract geopolitical game.
Yeah.
This is about the lives and futures of millions of people. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to seek out different perspectives,
Yeah.
and to form our own opinions about what's going on.
That's right. This has been the deep dive, and we hope that by exploring these diplomatic efforts surrounding the war in Ukraine, you've gained a better understanding of just how complex and nuanced this whole situation really is.
Remember, the future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the conversations we have. So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.